Can you paint a picture of the scale, of the depth of what has happened? How is this terror attack different in what we've seen before?
At first, when it happened, Israelis immediately compared it to the Yom Kippur War, when the armies of Syria and Egypt surprised the Israeli army and inflicted several military defeats on it before the army regrouped. But as more and more horrible stories began to come out from the villages around the Gaza Strip, it dawned on us, on Israelis, that this is something completely different, that the imagination, the comparisons went to the Holocaust, to pogroms against Jews in previous centuries, because the aim of Hamas was not to do battle with the Israeli military. It was to annihilate entire civilian communities. My aunt and uncle live in one of these communities in Kibbutz Be'eri, and I have many friends in the other kibbutzim nearby, and I've heard so many horrible stories in the last few days. My aunt and uncle hid in their house as terrorists just went systematically from house to house in their kibbutz, murdering, slaughtering everybody they found, sometimes torturing them in the most horrendous ways they could imagine. And this was done intentionally. I mean, the fact that Hamas attacked civilians, that people were tortured and executed in gruesome ways, and that this was not hidden. Hamas intended this to be publicized. It was intentional, because the aim of the attack was really to sow seeds of hatred and violence for generations to come, to destroy all chance for peace for generations to come. This was not an attack meant to restart the peace process, just the opposite, to bury it. First, I would like to point out that the immediate background to the attack was that Israel was very close to signing a historic peace treaty with Saudi Arabia, which was meant to normalize relations between Israel and much of the Arab world, to alleviate the suffering of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories, and to restart the peace process. And this frightened Hamas, which is why it launched this attack. And secondly, that the villages that were attacked, the kibbutzim on the border with Gaza, they were some of the staunchest and last bastions of the peace movement in Israel. You hear now story after story of people like Vivian Silver, who is a 74-year-old lady from my uncle's kibbutz and a peace activist. After living for years under attacks from Gaza, she still dedicated much of her time to driving sick people from the Gaza Strip to receive treatment in Israeli hospitals. And she's been a victim. We don't know if she's killed. Her body wasn't found. We hope that she's now a hostage in Gaza. And again, this was intentional. When Hamas's aim was to destroy all chance for peace.
And can you, in brief terms, describe like the stages that the Israeli people have come through emotionally? Like what was the first response and then the next steps to where we are now?
So then the first response was a shock at the military surprise, but then this changed into horror and existential dread and simply immense pain. For many Israelis now, the mind is just completely immersed in pain, and therefore they're also totally incapable of feeling or recognizing the pain of anyone else. Like I talk with one person after another, there is so much pain, they just want to tell you about their pain. If for a single moment you try to point at the pain of other people, like Palestinian civilians in Gaza, many of them are enraged and they feel completely betrayed. And I can't blame them. Psychologically, for many of them, it's now simply impossible to be with anything besides their own pain. I think the same thing about the Palestinians, that also I don't expect them to have any sympathy for the pain of Israelis because they too are completely immersed in their pain. But I do expect from people, outsiders, like people in Germany, unless they themselves come from Israel or Palestine or have relatives there, if you're just an outsider, don't be intellectually lazy, don't be emotionally lazy, don't see just part of this terrible reality. Try to see as much of the reality as you can, because the people there now in the midst of the suffering, they are incapable of doing it. But we need outsiders to somehow keep a space for future peace, because we can't keep that space right now.
The level of threat has been raised by this and also by what might come next.
Yes.
What is the sentiment? How do you live with this threat that is existential? How do you live with that in Israel?
We've lived with this threat throughout our lives, throughout the existence of the state, but now it's very palpable, it's concrete. You have already the war with Hamas. There is the threat that Hezbollah will come in, that Iran will come in, that this will spread and become a regional conflict, which could really put the very existence of the country in danger. Even if you were just focusing on the Gaza Strip and Hamas there, for years we lived in a kind of violent coexistence with Hamas. Every week or so there was an attack, a mortar attack, a rocket being fired, some Israeli retaliation. Every year or two there would be a big military operation. But the feeling was that we can contain this, we can live with this. Like my uncle's community, they lived through these many years of conflict, managing relatively normal lives about a kilometer away from the fence with Gaza. Now, those of them who are not dead or hostage in Gaza, they are refugees. Israel now has tens of thousands of refugees that fled from the border areas. They cannot go back as long as Hamas rules Gaza, because the feeling is we need to find a way to live with the Palestinian people, but not with Hamas. Hamas is not the Palestinian people, and after what happened, after this massacre, there is just no way for Israelis to go on existing side by side with such a terrorist organization.
Now looking to next steps, do you trust in the government to maintain a cool head in navigating this crisis?
No. Personally, I've been a critic of the Netanyahu government for years. The last 9 months, there's been a very big struggle in Israel to preserve Israeli democracy. I have no trust in Netanyahu and the people around him. I think he should have done the right thing and just resigned. Take responsibility for the catastrophe and just resign. It's not just so much, paying the price for past mistakes. There'll be time to look at past mistakes. Right now, some of the most important decisions in the history of Israel and maybe of the region have to be made, and I just don't trust Netanyahu to make them. Luckily, we did manage, the government was enlarged, and there are some more responsible people that got in, and that's a good thing. I'm even more comforted that the Biden administration has stepped in a remarkable way. I don't have words to express how much I appreciate and what Biden and his administration have been doing. Netanyahu has given them very hard time and lots of criticism and even mockery for years. And at the moment of crisis, they put it all aside. And what they are doing is remarkable. What the US is doing is remarkable because again, I don't know what will happen in the next few days. So I'm talking from the present perspective. So far, they have made one of the best uses I've ever seen of military power. You know, military power, we usually think about it as a weapon for destruction, but what the US has just done, they sent immense military power, the 2 aircraft carriers and a lot of support for Israel, with the aim of de-escalating the conflict, of by intervening so forcefully, telling Israel, it's on us, we have your back, but because of that, we also have the power to restrain you and to restrain the other actors in the arena, because the number one priority right now is to prevent further escalation. Don't let the fire, the terrible fire, spread to Lebanon, to the West Bank, potentially to the whole region.
Looking at the impending and maybe already started ground offensive, or the first parts of it, some commentators call this unavoidable. Other commentators call it a trap, a mistake. What's your take?
I'm not a military expert, so I can't comment on the immediate military moves. I'll say that the feeling of most Israelis, including again the kind of remnants of the peace movement that lived in those kibbutzim, that Israel, it's either Israel or Hamas. It's just impossible for Israel, after what happened, it's impossible for Israelis to go on living a few kilometers from the border fence with an organization like Hamas on the other side. I mean, where is the guarantee that if we have a ceasefire now, they will not come again to slaughter and torture and execute because this is their aim, their goal. And what is, I think, very difficult for people in Europe to understand often is the mind frame behind this, that there are people, and I know it because there are also people like that in my country. There are people who just don't care about this world and about human suffering in this world because they are fixated on fantasies about another world. They think that it doesn't matter if millions suffer now because after death we go to heaven and there have everlasting bliss. And this is not some kind of, what are you involving these religious fantasies? Here we are talking seriously about politics. In the Middle East, this is politics. This is the bedrock where everything starts. And from the perspective of Hamas, not just slaughtering Israeli civilians, even the suffering of Palestinians doesn't count. Because, if a Palestinian is killed, according to Hamas, they are martyrs. They immediately go to heaven. What's the problem? We cannot coexist with such people holding immense military capabilities on our border. How to get them out, how to disarm them, this is a big question. An even bigger question is what will replace them. Yes, it is possible with enough force to disarm Hamas. What then? We need to ensure that in the process of disarming Hamas, we respect the human rights of Palestinian civilians who are not to blame for what the terrorists have been doing. And we need to provide them with a future, that they can look forward to a future when they can live in the Gaza Strip, not just live lives, but live dignified lives. And this is a double struggle that Israel is now waging. We have to win the war with Hamas, but also we have to win the war on our own humanity, not to degrade ourselves to the level of the terrorists. I've been hearing all kinds of ideas about what can be done. What to do with the Palestinian civilians in Gaza that Hamas is using as human shields. Egypt is closing the border, doesn't want to receive these refugees. I've heard suggestions that Israel should receive them. Temporarily for the duration of the war, accept women and children and sick people from hospitals. The international community will build refugee camps on Israeli soil for the duration of the war, and after the war they'll go back to Gaza. I don't know if this is, like a wishful thinking or a serious suggestion, but I would explore anything to see if there is a way forward.
What kind of courses of action or sequence of events are you afraid of for the coming days? What are you afraid of?
I'm most afraid of escalation of the conflict spreading to the West Bank, to Lebanon. Then if this happens, that all the suffering we've seen so far is nothing compared to the amount of suffering we might see. Tens of thousands of dead, millions of refugees. The first priority is to de-escalate and prevent this.
How would you, what do you hope for? How would you put that into words? Hope.
And first, hope that it doesn't escalate. Second, that we can de-escalate. The first step should be the immediate release of all the hostages held by Hamas, immediately and unconditionally. When I hear people say, well, you have to give them something, no. I mean, if somebody holds a 2-year-old baby as a hostage, you don't need to give that person anything. Just release the baby immediately. And if this happens, this gives a first ray of hope. In the longer term, again, Israel was on the verge of making a peace treaty, which would have restarted, hopefully, also the peace process with the Palestinians. It's too early to talk about it now. And again, Israelis and also Palestinians are at present immersed in pain. But we know from history that after years, the pain heals somewhat. And Germans and Israelis, or Germans and Jews, after what happened during the Holocaust, eventually they became friends. So if this is possible, then anything is possible.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.